The Great Gatsby. Full book summary. Nick Carraway, a young man from Minnesota, moves to New York in the summer of 1922 to learn about the bond business. He rents a house in the West Egg district of Long Island, a wealthy but unfashionable area populated by the new rich, a group who have made their fortunes too recently to have established social connections and who are prone to garish displays of wealth. Nick's next-door neighbor in West Egg is a mysterious man named Jay Gatsby, who lives in a gigantic Gothic mansion and throws extravagant parties every Saturday night. Nick is unlike the other inhabitants of West Egg. He was educated at Yale and has social connections in East Egg, a fashionable area of Long Island home to the established upper class. Nick drives out to East Egg one evening for dinner with his cousin, Daisy Buchanan, and her husband, Tom, an erstwhile classmate of Nick's at Yale. Daisy and Tom introduce Nick to Jordan Baker, a beautiful, cynical young woman with whom Nick begins a romantic relationship. Nick also learns a bit about Daisy and Tom's marriage. Jordan tells him that Tom has a lover, Myrtle Wilson, who lives in the Valley of Ashes, a gray industrial dumping ground between West Egg and New York City. Not long after this revelation, Nick travels to New York City with Tom and Myrtle. At a vulgar, gaudy party in the apartment that Tom keeps for the affair, Myrtle begins to taunt Tom about Daisy, and Tom responds by breaking her nose. As the summer progresses, Nick eventually garners an invitation to one of Gatsby's legendary parties. He encounters Jordan Baker at the party, and they meet Gatsby himself, a surprisingly young man who affects an English accent, has a remarkable smile, and calls everyone old sport. Gatsby asks to speak to Jordan alone, and, through Jordan, Nick later learns more about his mysterious neighbor. Gatsby tells Jordan that he knew Daisy in Louisville in 1917 and is deeply in love with her. He spends many nights staring at the green light at the end of her dock, across the bay from his mansion. Gatsby's extravagant lifestyle and wild parties are simply an attempt to impress Daisy. Gatsby now wants Nick to arrange a reunion between himself and Daisy, but he is afraid that Daisy will refuse to see him if she knows that he still loves her. Nick invites Daisy to have tea at his house, without telling her that Gatsby will also be there. After an initially awkward reunion, Gatsby and Daisy re-establish their connection. Their love rekindled, they begin an affair. After a short time, Tom grows increasingly suspicious of his wife's relationship with Gatsby. At a luncheon at the Buchanan's house, Gatsby stares at Daisy with such undisguised passion that Tom realizes Gatsby is in love with her. Though Tom is himself involved in an extramarital affair, he is deeply outraged by the thought that his wife could be unfaithful to him. He forces the group to drive into New York City, where he confronts Gatsby in a suite at the Plaza Hotel. Tom asserts that he and Daisy have a history that Gatsby could never understand, and he announces to his wife that Gatsby is a criminal. His fortune comes from bootlegging alcohol and other illegal activities. Daisy realizes that her allegiance is to Tom, and Tom contemptuously sends her back to East Egg with Gatsby, attempting to prove that Gatsby cannot hurt him. When Nick, Jordan, and Tom drive through the Valley of Ashes, however, they discover that Gatsby's car has struck and killed Myrtle, Tom's lover. They rush back to Long Island, where Nick learns from Gatsby that Daisy was driving the car when it struck Myrtle, but that Gatsby intends to take the blame. The next day, Tom tells Myrtle's husband, George, that Gatsby was the driver of the car. George, who has leapt to the conclusion that the driver of the car that killed Myrtle must have been her lover, finds Gatsby in the pool at his mansion and shoots him dead. He then fatally shoots himself. Nick stages a small funeral for Gatsby, ends his relationship with Jordan, and moves back to the Midwest to escape the disgust he feels for the people surrounding Gatsby's life and for the emptiness and moral decay of life among the wealthy on the East Coast. Nick reflects that just as Gatsby's dream of Daisy was corrupted by money and dishonesty, the American dream of happiness and individualism has disintegrated into the mere pursuit of wealth. Though Gatsby's power to transform his dreams into reality is what makes him great, Nick reflects that the era of dreaming, both Gatsby's dream and the American dream, is over. Full book analysis. The Great Gatsby is a story about the impossibility of recapturing the past and also the difficulty of altering one's future. The protagonist of the novel is Jay Gatsby, who is the mysterious and wealthy neighbor of the narrator, Nick Carraway. Although we know little about Gatsby at first, we know from Nick's introduction, and from the book's title, that Gatsby's story will be the focus of the novel. As the novel progresses and Nick becomes increasingly drawn into Gatsby's complicated world, we learn what Gatsby wants: Daisy, Nick's cousin, the girl he once loved. Anything and anyone that stands between Gatsby and Daisy becomes an antagonist. Although Daisy's brutish husband Tom is the most obvious antagonist, a variety of more abstract concepts, such as class difference, societal expectations, and Gatsby's past lies, can also be considered antagonists. The most powerful antagonist is time itself, which prevents Gatsby from recapturing what he lost. After a brief passage which frames the narrative as Nick's recollections of a summer from his past, the narrative is for the most part linear, beginning with Nick's move to New York, which makes him Gatsby's neighbor. Gatsby is wealthy, with a mysterious past that is the subject of much speculation. After meeting his neighbor at a party, Nick learns that despite Gatsby's success, he longs only for Daisy. Gatsby's central aim through the novel is to see Daisy again and recapture their shared past. On a trip to the city with Tom, Nick meets Tom's mistress, Myrtle. In the rising action of the novel, Nick arranges a reunion between Gatsby and Daisy, and Jordan tells Nick about Daisy and Gatsby's history. Gatsby and Daisy fall back in love, and Gatsby tells Nick one version of his life story. Many of the stories Gatsby tells about himself turn out to be lies or half-truths. The fantastic nature of his stories gives Gatsby's history a mythical quality, which reinforces the sense of him as a tragic hero. Gatsby and Daisy are briefly happy together, and Nick gets drawn into their romance, even though the outlook for the couple's future seems hopeless, largely because of Gatsby's inability to separate his dreams from reality. Both the reader and Nick can see the disparity between Gatsby's idealized image of the Daisy he knew 5 years earlier, and the actual character of Daisy herself. Fitzgerald presents Daisy as a shallow, materialistic character, reinforcing the sense that Gatsby is chasing a dream, rather than a real person. There must have been moments even that afternoon when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. On an outing into the city, Gatsby erupts and tells everyone in the room that he and Daisy are in love and are going to run away together to marry. However, Tom says Daisy will never leave him, and Daisy is unable to tell Tom she never loved him. Here, for the first time, Gatsby must confront directly the possibility that his dream cannot be attained, and see Daisy as she currently is, rather than his idealized remembrance of her. Even at this point, however, he remains convinced she will ultimately choose him over Tom. The climax of the novel comes when the group is driving back from New York in 2 cars, and Myrtle, Tom's lover, mistakes Gatsby's car for Tom's and runs out into the street and is hit and killed. The car that kills Myrtle belongs to Gatsby, but Daisy is driving. After this, the action resolves quickly. Gatsby takes the blame in order to protect Daisy, and Myrtle's husband, George, kills Gatsby, and then himself, as revenge. Gatsby has already died a symbolic death at this point, when he realizes that Daisy will not call him and is not going to run away with him after all. His dream is at last obliterated, and he heads into the morning of his death facing reality for the first time. Nick describes the world as Gatsby now sees it as unbearably ugly. He found what a grotesque thing a rose is and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. In contrast to the previous obsession with the past, the final passages of Gatsby's life are concerned with newness, creation, and the future, one which, lacking his dream of Daisy, he finds hideous. In the final falling action of the book, Nick must also confront reality, as he realizes his glamorous, enigmatic neighbor was the poor son of farmers who got mixed up in criminal activities and had no true friends besides Nick. Nick tries to arrange a funeral for Gatsby, but none of the guests from his lavish parties come. Daisy and Tom leave town, and Nick is left alone with Gatsby's father, who reveals the truth of his son's humble beginnings as James Gats. After the funeral, Nick decides to return to the Midwest, where he is from, feeling disgusted by the distortions of the East. First, though, he visits Gatsby's house one last time, boarded up and already defaced with graffiti, and reflects on the power of the green light at the end of Daisy's dock that kindled Gatsby hope of recapturing the past, up until the moment of his death. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, he says, including himself in the tragedy of Gatsby's fall.